2 Samuel 6. A whole chapter. We don't do that often, but this one is an interesting one. And it speaks so much to our theme today, God-inspired joy. And there are so many steps to that dance that I want to walk with you through our chapter from beginning to end. And if you want to follow along in your Bible, that's fine. But this is a story out of ancient Israel that sounds so far away that it has nothing to do with what we are about here. It's about a king. We don't have kings. It's about offering. We don't do offerings in an animal sense. And then there are all those weird names that are hard to pronounce. So far off that story. But yet it speaks to human steps in dancing and spirituality in life that we can actually do. At the very beginning, it's about God's tabernacle. And you may or may not remember, that's basically a little wooden box that may not have contained some sort of scroll in it. But it represented the presence of God that kept God's people alive when they wandered through the desert from Egypt into the promised land and has been with them ever since. That little golden box called tabernacle is God's presence. God is with us in that little box. And over the time, they've created new vehicles for it. First, they just carried it. In this story, they put it on a cart. And ultimately, we learn it's going to end up in the temple. So here we have God's presence on a cart and a big parade following it all around. 30,000 people. Way too big a number. That many people didn't live in the area. But they were parading behind that box. And it was wild. God in a box, and we can all follow. That's a big deal. Imagine we could do that. Imagine we had a box that provides the presence of God. And we would do a parade around town. Awesome. And it was so wild with their cart. The way the scene is described almost sounds like God was on Mardi Gras float. And what we learned is the people were dancing all around it. It tells you something about worship and what we're supposed to do on Sunday mornings. Worship is dancing. Worship is dancing. And that's exactly what we do a lot of times. During Vacation Bible School, during Children's Church, that's what we teach our kids. They dance. For them, church is dancing. And when you went to VBS or Children's Church as little ones, you remember that your songs were always funner than those of the old folks. We teach our little ones to dance. That's what church is for them. And as grown-ups, we teach them to unlearn that. We teach them that church is sitting down for exactly 1 hour. David and the people of Israel around that tabernacle, for them it's all about passion and excitement. They want to move like little kids. We teach ourselves to sit down and be quiet. Teachers know what I'm talking about. How do you learn best? Sitting down, quietly? For some. Sometimes sitting is so hard, you just got to stand up, right? And sometimes it's fair to allow somebody to go to the back of the classroom, or maybe in the sanctuary, just stand in the back wall. Maybe that's better than falling asleep in the pew. That's fair. I actually offer that. If you want to do that, just stand in the back. That's cool. So here's my first piece of homework that I wanted to offer you today. Get up more than you normally would. Sit less. Sitting is David and 30,000 people had God present amongst them in that little tabernacle, they danced around. I don't need you to dance yet, but sit nice. All right? So when our story progresses and that parade is going on, and eventually they settle in a place where they want to stay for a little while, and Uzzah, one of the guys, reaches at the tabernacle, touching it. And what happens is, the anger of God kindled against him, we hear. The anger of God kindled against Uzzah. And God struck him down and he was dead. Well, God didn't want to be touched. And then David, the king, got angry because God got angry. That's how anger works, right? And then David was afraid of God and didn't want anything to do with that box anymore and ran off and left it there. That's our relationships right now, right? One steps the other, angry at each other, run away. But he left it there. Sometimes our relationship with God can be like that. Sometimes God is scary. Sometimes it's better that God lives in that little box that we can just put away. It's safer that way sometimes. You don't want to get too close because the maker of heaven and earth is so powerful and that might be scary. Because we really want to get a hold of God and manage God the way we need God, right? We need to control God. Handing God in a little box would just be right, but sometimes it's safer to put him in a kennel. Because that story that we just heard almost sounds like a dog that God can bite. Uzzah felt it. So it's safer to take in that God thing in smaller doses. When we first went on that parade with the 30,000 people dancing, that was all fun and good. But now that it's getting serious, yeah, maybe we should limit our exposure here a little bit. Maybe we do church on Sundays only. Okay? Let's confine God to that little space, 1/7 of our week. It's probably safer, because otherwise it messes up our whole lives. Let's reduce our spiritual practice to corporate worship. Let's get together with a few dozen folks, sit in the same room for about an hour, no, exactly an hour, do what we always do, and keep God in that box. That's safe. Some go to the other extreme, and they say that God that is so unpredictable and dangerous, I want nothing to do with that at all. If I need to live my spirituality, I'll just do that on my own. Go into that corporate worship box that y'all go to, nah, I can do that on my own. I got God in my heart, I'm all right. Well, the reality is that it takes a balanced approach between those two extremes. It takes both corporate and individual worship. Here's my second piece of homework that I'd suggest for you. Look at your spiritual practices. Maybe you need to get used to that word, because that's not really a word that we use a lot of times. Spiritual practices, I don't have any of that. Well, maybe you do, you just don't call them that yet. Go to church is one. Saying grace over your meal would be another one. Thanking God in prayer after the day is done. Look at the Bible every now and then. It doesn't have to be big things. You don't need foam of your mouth, coming out of your mouth and dancing like crazy. But look at what you do to feed your spirit. And see if you're afraid of that God box and want to put it away, or if you're allowed and free to touch it, or not that scared. beyond everything you've ever heard. God's presence can be a good thing also. Not only scary, but also full of blessing. God's presence was good for this family. Your house can be blessed if you got a box in it that has God in it. Now there's a problem here. Because if your God is locked up in your house, people get envious. And that's what happened. King David rushed in again and said, I want it. Now that it's not scary anymore, but I see it blesses you and your house, I want in on that deal. I want that box back. Because it's so beautiful when things fall into place. Everything for your family worked out. You're all healthy and rich and beautiful. I want that. Give me that box back. The good news is, King David didn't want it for himself. But he wanted to put it out for the public, to share it. So he took it like we need to take the good news for ourselves. When the good life happens, when blessings occur in our lives, don't keep silent about it. Tell your neighbors, tell your friends, tell your co-workers, I'm blessed. God's presence has been good for you. So David took the Ark of God and put it into the city of Jerusalem. And again, David danced. David danced before the Lord, we read, with all his might. Don't forget your dancing, right? Again, we had a little parade with that float and that dancing, but this time the dancing was even wilder. We don't know the number of the crowd, but there was more dancing. Remember how I told you to sit less? Get up right now. If you can, if your physician advises against it, don't do it, okay? So be smart in what you do. But worship is dancing. And we're not practiced at dancing. But I want us to move more, so let's do 10 squats. If your physician allows, if it makes sense for your body, if it doesn't, just remain standing. That's better than sitting. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Thank you. Dancing is worship. Worship is dancing. Moving is a spiritual practice. We just did 10 squats in the name of God. Good job. Now when you do stuff like that, it doesn't look very appropriate sometimes. Because doing squats in church is really silly. And did we videotape this? Well, maybe we did. There's always a camera in it. But it can look really silly if a church does squats. People may be appalled. Or envious if they want to move and are not allowed in their church. But there's a lady that saw King David dancing like crazy, and she told him, "You're crazy." Michal approached him, and she saw him leaping and dancing before the Lord, and she despised him in her heart. "You're making a fool of yourself," she said. "You're making a fool of yourself. How dare you deriving earthly pleasure from the divine presence? Just because you think you got God in the box, you can dance around like a fool? Who do you think you are? Who's God for God's sake? There will always be that one person. The Bible knows that. You just heard it. Problem is, Michael, she didn't dance with him. She was a bystander. She wasn't engaged. She was just looking. And you know what? Bickering from the sideline is super easy. You sit up on the balcony, you can bicker all the way you want. But if you don't dance, you don't get a vote. Because when you keep yourself distant, your safe distance like Michael did, peeking out the window, oh, what are those crazy people dancing down there? Keeping your safe distance, it's not relational. That's just you and your little self-righteousness. If you don't get to dance, you don't get a vote. So ultimately, all that dancing led to the right place. They brought the ark to where it was supposed to go. And guess what churches do once they know that God is with them? David distributed food among all the people. That's what the response is when God's presence arrives in the holy place. The holy multitude of Israel will hear both men and women to each a cake of bread, a portion of meat, and a cake of raisins. You may culturally adjust that to whatever favorite you got. But celebrating God's arrival in our sanctuary is celebrated with acts of justice, because everybody got it. Nobody's hungry that day. And it inspires acts of hospitality, because food brings people together. God's presence is about sharing joy with the community, and that is out in the open. Everybody gets to eat, and everybody gets to see that God's presence among us brings us celebration and joy, food, and justice, and hospitality. By the way, hunger is not a matter of charity, but a matter of justice. And when we do potlucks after church or for events and meals after memorial services, that's exactly what we do. Eating, just like dancing, is an integral part of worship. And King David brought the ark to the holy place. He distributed food among all the people. God's presence in the temple means food for the people. And that should be part of our spiritual practice. Remember when I suggested to say grace over your meals? Eating is a holy thing. Some of you all will have to get up again, maybe not. But there's people sitting all around you. And if you are in the habit of saying grace over your meal, or if you're not, talk to the person behind or in front of you, not necessarily next to you because you know them too well. How you do or could say grace. Just share your quickest, easiest prayer over a meal that you say. Just share best practice. Do you do it? How do you do it? Just inspire us. 2 minutes of chatter. You're allowed to talk. Eating is worship just like dancing is worship. When God arrives What's up with Michael? She's still mad because she saw King David dancing like the vulgar fellow, shamelessly uncovering himself, the way she put it. Well, dear Michael, we've all been there. If your neighbors are having a party, you have two options. You can call the police and let them enforce the noise ordinance, or you can join them. Michael decided to stay on the sideline and hold a grudge. The rest of everybody else wanted to get involved in the dancing and celebrate. So today we did a good start of making the church noisy. We were mumbling loud over those prayers. And we made a good start by dancing, moving more, and sitting less. Let's celebrate God's presence, dancing, eating, and our spiritual